Hi there, everybody. I hope you had a very good spring break. It is Sunday night, March 21st, and the week coming up has a lot of things going on. So I thought I would combine a lecture today with some miscellaneous notes for your research paper that are coming up. And at the end of the slideshow, I'll talk about some other things um, going on this week as the semester progresses in terms of our reading. So let's get started here. I will go through these slides and perhaps even write some notes on them as we go along. It is 12 slides, so it's a pretty long lecture. However, because I did finish reading your rough draft for your research paper, I put a grade on it, and at this point, you should be reading your comments and beginning to revise your research paper. So your thesis. Let me talk a little bit about the thesis for your research paper. Make sure your thesis is making an argument that others can debate, even if you or most of us think that most people would agree with your interpretation. Remember, literature is not math. Literature is not 2 plus 2 equals 4. Literature is rhetorical. Literature makes arguments in terms of your interpretation of it. Of course, the plot of any piece of literature is set. We know what happens in the plot, but the plot provides evidence for your interpretation about things like style, narration, symbols, and of course, theme. So we've talked about this all semester, and I'm reiterating it to you for this paper coming up. Make sure your thesis refers to ideas throughout the paper. So in essence, make sure you refer back to your thesis throughout the paper and use exact words or synonyms of the words that come from your thesis. That way your readers, your audience, that is me, or tutors who read your paper, understand that you're continuing to prove the ideas that come from your thesis. So here's a sample thesis. This is actually the sample thesis from the Sample A quality research paper I posted on Blackboard. The thesis says, in her play, Hansberry illustrates 20th century feminism through a woman's desire to have an identity, to be independent and respected not only by the men in her life, but also by the women. So throughout the paper, the student uses words such as identity, independent, of course, because those two words are in the thesis. But you don't want to repeat those same words over and over and over again, because then it will become monotonous and repetitious. So you can say things like self-possession, individuality, self-assurance. For the word respect, you can use esteem. So these are the kinds of things that will be helpful to create a solid, organized, and coherent paper. The title of the story and the author of your story must be somewhere in the introduction. So don't start your paper with something like, in the story this happens. Even though you have a title and the title has the story's name in it, you really need to have that title and author somewhere in the introduction. The title of the story must be in quotation marks, not in italics, and not both, just quotation marks. One final thing I want to mention that's not on this slideshow, but that just occurred to me right now, so I'm going to write it right here. Title should tell us, what paper is about. So not research essay. A good title might be something like Identity in the Story of an Hour, or mental insanity, depression, and illness in The Yellow Wallpaper, revenge in The Cask of Amontillado. You can make a cute, clever title too, but that's not going to get you extra points. It might make me chuckle, it might make me laugh, it might make me happy going into reading your paper, but I do want a title that's indicative of what your paper will be about. Let me move to the next slide. Okay, biography of your author. By all means, you may write about the biography of the author if it relates to your interpretation of the story. I have listed it as a requirement in the assignment, but you do not need to incorporate biography unless you think it will support your thesis. I know some of you already have done so. Maybe some of you were planning on it. Maybe some of you were not. I don't want to force you to write about the biography. At this point, it can be something that you include, especially if it's helpful. With writers like Judith Ortiz Cofer, who's a Puerto Rican woman who had similar experiences to her narrator, the same as Chopin, the same as Charlotte Perkins Gilman. By the way, that's her name, not Charlotte Perkins Stetson. That's her name later. She's Gilman when she actually published the story. Okay, moving on. Speaking of Judith Ortiz Cofer, I'm going to mention something about her, which I think I've already said, but I'm going to say it again, because quite a number of you are writing about the story Volar. You may not, in the TCC library database, find something that is specifically related to the story Volar. So if you type in her name, or if you type in the story title in quotation marks, maybe nothing will come up. However, I actually did this a few minutes ago. I used all three of these databases, the Literature Resource Center, Bloom's Literature, and Literature Criticism Online. I typed in her name. There are lots of articles with not just biography about her, not just biographical information, but also other analyses about her work that do relate to her as a Puerto Rican writer and that can be utilized as research. So I was just skimming through some of those ideas, and there are interviews with Judith Ortiz Cofer, for instance, which tell us some information about who she is and what kind of writer she is and what kind of things she writes about. So those will be helpful if you read through those and find some good information about her. Okay, context. Some of you, I wrote the word context in my comments on your papers. And when I mention the word context, I could mean the history or background surrounding the point you are making. So the context of this issue. I could also mean that you need more information about the parts of the plot that surround the point you are making. So if I say, you need more context of the story in order to make this point, that means you've made a point suddenly or abruptly without giving us, the readers, enough information on how you came to that point. Okay, I'm going to talk about direct quotes here and looking at the Turnitin numbers after you've turned in your rough draft. You want, for your final copy, a 25% direct quote maximum. So that is, when you check your rough draft, you'll see a number on the right bar. You've done this all semester. I'm sure you know what this is, but I'm just reiterating this to you now. It's called the match overview. When you click it, you'll see not only the percentage of direct quotes that the Turnitin program found online that directly match quotes in your paper, but you'll also see where they came from. Why, for instance, does it say that your quote came from another student's paper? It's because the program found the quote from that paper first. especially a quote from one of your short stories, because so many thousands and thousands of students have written about these short stories before in the past 20 years since the Turnitin program has been utilized. Those quotes are everywhere. And so that's just the very first place that the Turnitin program found the quote. It doesn't mean, though, that the quotes are plagiarized, of course. If you have quotation marks around the direct quotes, they are not plagiarized. They could be plagiarized if you forgot the citation. And of course, they could be plagiarized if you forgot the quotation marks. This number should be 25% maximum. Again, if it's 26 or 27, I'll be okay with that. If it's anything above that, you need to find places in your paper where you can cut down the direct quotes. Use ellipses to cut down some of the quotes. Take some out entirely. Paraphrase others, particularly your research. Find quotes that are most important. And I talk about this in other slideshows that hopefully you've looked at prior to this one during the course of the semester. Here's one other thing I'd like to talk about. Once you have a complete draft that you think is your final copy, I strongly urge you to resubmit it into the rough draft paper number 2 link. And that way you'll see if at that point where you think the paper is ready to be turned in, your percentage of direct quotes is too high or it's even too low. A very low percentage is probably not good either, as you absolutely need direct quotes as supporting evidence in a paper that analyzes literature. You should resubmit your paper at least a few hours before the final paper is due on Sunday, March 28th, and that way you have time to revise. Now, obviously, if you only are finishing the paper in the last few minutes before it's due next Sunday, then you won't have time to do this, and you could be submitting a paper with 40% direct quotes. The other thing I would like you to remember, and I'll go ahead and write this on here too, the number of the match overview, whatever the number is, does not mean you have or have not plagiarized. So certainly, if that number on the right is 75 or 60 or 50, then certainly you have probably plagiarized somewhere and you don't know it, because you're certainly not putting 50% of your quotes or 50% of your paper as direct quotes on purpose. However, I have had plenty of papers that are 12% direct quotes, that number is 12, or that number is 15, and they actually are plagiarized because of that 15%, one or more of the quotes either don't have quotation marks around them or don't have a citation. And that, of course, is considered plagiarism. If you've looked at the plagiarism, how to avoid plagiarism PowerPoint that I posted a week or 2 ago, if you have not looked at that and studied it, I suggest you do so. I think only so far 24 people. And at this point, I have about, I would say 75 people who are actively involved in my classes and doing the work and keeping up with things. So please look that one over as well, and that can help you as you move forward with this paper. Okay, Control F. You may have used this before, you may have not, but use Control F on your keyboard to find something in your paper. So for instance, you're in Microsoft Word, you need to find the title of your story, anywhere that you've put it in your paper. After you hit Control F, type in the title, and then you can look at every instance that you've used the title. See if it's spelled correctly. See if it's properly in quotation marks. See if it's capitalized correctly, etc. So use Control F for anything. Um, I even suggest that you use it for errors like comma splices, where after you finished your entire paper, you click Control F and then you put in the comma, not the word comma, just the comma itself. And MS Word will highlight every instance of commas. And you'll be able to see, have I created a comma splice, which is an error, or is my comma used correctly? There are grammar errors, abundant in many people's papers. So keep calm and proofread, as I found this little meme here. Comma splices, which I just mentioned. A comma splice occurs when you use a comma to separate two complete sentences. You must use a period or a semicolon instead. Fragments or incomplete sentences. If I found a fragment in your papers, and I actually did look at grammar errors in your rough draft this time, so you can see where you might be going wrong. Reread those fragments, see what you have done. Most of the time, you can connect that sentence fragment to the sentence that comes right before it, and you'll have a complete sentence. Try not to commit that same fragment error in any subsequent sentences. Apostrophes. A lot of you either misuse apostrophes or don't use them at all. Capital letters, proper names, and words that are proper nouns must be capitalized. And then this last one says sentence awkwardness, clarity, and wordiness. I've mentioned all of these in your individual papers. So be on the lookout for those comments as you reread what I've mentioned in your rough draft. Tense shift and improper use of tenses. This is an error that everyone has committed. And by that, I mean everyone. I don't think there's a single student who has every tense in your rough draft correct. I have mentioned this several times in the past, but I'll reiterate it again. You write about literature in present tense. So here's a sentence that has several present tense verbs that you might decide you should put in past because some of this could have happened in the past in the story. They actually all go in present. Kate Chopin's story reflects the nature of freedom as Louise ponders her husband's death. She is now feeling self-assured. Even though she initially feels grief at his passing, she gets over it quickly. All of those are present tense verbs. So when I say tense shift, okay, tense shift is the comment I make, and that's an error that you've made in your paper. If, however, there's a historical moment in your paper or you're writing biographical material, of course, then write in past tense. So Hemingway wrote minimalist prose in his lifetime. He was known to be an alcoholic as well. All of those are in the past. That's about him, so that's past tense. We're coming close to the end here. We're on slide 11. Direct quotes. You must have some direct quotes from the story in your paper. That's a given. We knew that from this time and from your rough draft and from your last paper. Many of you got very poor grades on paper number 1 because you did not include a single direct quote from the story. That is important in a literary analysis. If you have a long quote, you must set it off from the margin of the paper 5 spaces. And really, you should only have one long quote more than 3 lines in the whole paper. And that's either a long quote from the story or from your research. You can certainly use ellipses to cut down on quotes, which I mentioned before in this lecture. You may not have a long quote at all. That's perfectly fine. But if you do have one, make sure you set it off. And then finally, this is the last slide, and it's about research. You may use each piece of research more than once. Some of you have done that already, and I applaud that. because that means you're looking through and reading the research carefully to find the argument that the researcher is making and finding quotes about that argument to help supplement and support you. You must, however, cite 4 sources total in your paper. That does not mean you can cite one source 4 times, 4 separate sources. Research should be incorporated throughout the paper, not just in one paragraph. I have had students do that before. They stick all their research in one paragraph and think that's acceptable. It's not. A research paper shows that you're utilizing ideas as support, evidence, and supplementary material throughout your paper to prove your thesis. Please read in Blackboard the MLA format pages, as well as all pages in the literary research folder for more information on citing properly in the text and at the end of the works cited page. In the works cited page, sorry. I have posted a sample research paper. Please read it over. It is longer than 1,500 words. It's like about 1,800 words, which is a page, a little less than a page longer than what I have you writing, but it's still a very good paper that does everything right in terms of research and support. Finally, not just any sources are acceptable for your research paper. I said this in the assignment too, and I'm repeating it here again. Some of you are using sources that are not credible or authoritative, and I mentioned that singularly to each one of you who did that. So if I have made comments about certain sources that you've used, please read those. As you're continuing to research and write your paper and you have a question on whether a source is authoritative or not, please ask me. You can email me. You can come to my office hours on Monday. I am going to have some extra office hours later this week in the evening, and I will post those. I think probably Wednesday and Thursday I'll have extra evening office hours, and on Saturday I'll have perhaps a couple of extra office hours in the afternoon. I'm not sure about Saturday, but I know this week in the evening I will have more. And Sunday, before the paper is due, I think I'll have some more in the afternoon too. That's all in terms of the lecture. I do want to end with saying we are not going to do peer review. I couldn't figure out how to do it well while also allowing you to resubmit your paper to search for direct quotes. And to see the percentage of direct quotes and to make sure you haven't accidentally plagiarized or used too many direct quotes or too few. It didn't work out with the peer review this time, and I'll see if I can do it for the next set of papers, but for now, no peer review. But if you look at the top of Blackboard, you'll see the assignments coming up for this week. We have tonight, so I don't know that you'll be watching this tonight, but tonight, Sunday. If you turn it in tomorrow, it'll just be a late grade. But the second part of discussion board number 4, and then the third part is due on Tuesday. I just had it due 2 days later instead of 3. It is due Tuesday instead of Wednesday, so just bear that in mind. Read through the discussion board again carefully so that you know what you're doing. Extra credit, if you want the 5 extra points, make sure you send in your paper this week as early as possible to tutoring@TCC. So the 2 parts of the discussion board, extra credit. The paper itself is due on Sunday. And reading, we are starting our poetry unit. So I will have some lectures on poetry coming up this week. I've already posted one document in the week 10 folder, so open that folder for all of the poetry that's going on this week. Again, I know this is long today, but we needed to go over all of these things as your major research paper is coming up due. Let me know if you have any questions, and have a great week. Bye-bye.